Today we're going to look into the book of Matthew. So if you have a Bible, that's what you'll want to open to. Matthew chapter 12 specifically. We're going to be looking at just a few verses there. Today's message is called The Only Sign Given. Matthew chapter 12, we'll be looking at just a few verses starting with verse number 38. Let me read it to you from the New International Version of the Bible. This is what it says there. Some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, speaking of Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." You know, folks are always looking for a sign. When it comes to things divine, when it comes to things of God, there's nothing new in all of human history about that particular characteristic. Everyone, it seems, wants some sort of a sign. As it's always been, I think it will always be to the very end. When some folks call for a sign, I think that basically they're kind of looking for someone to do some magic tricks for them, for someone to prove themselves to them. Do something for me, then I'll believe, that kind of a thing. I don't think that that's a good attitude, and hopefully by the time that we're done this morning, you'll see why it doesn't really float. God is not someone that you could ever expect to do magic tricks. God's not the kind of person who is at our beckon and call to prove himself, or in any other way, somehow or another, treat us as if we're in a position to judge him. And yet I think at the root and heart of folks that are demanding a sign, that's really what's going on. It's in their own mind. They see themselves as being in a position to cast some kind of a judgment on God, and therefore they want him to stand up and do a dance before them or whatever. Well, that's not going to happen. Now, what kind of tricks would people like to do, or would like to have God do? Well, I think that of all the things that we can think of, Jesus has done more than enough. I think of all the things that are recorded in the scriptural accounts. Jesus turned water into wine. Didn't really do anything for anyone at the time that he did it. Very little. It had a relatively small amount of impact. He raised the dead. What did that do for anyone? Well, other than for Jairus, very few people were really all that impressed by it. Now, I know a lot of people were responding to when he raised Lazarus, but as far as the total population or the whole landscape of people goes, didn't make that much of an impact. Jesus did all kinds of things that demonstrated power and majesty, and that he was somebody who had God's ear. I think of just all of the demons that he cast out in and of itself. That would have been quite a remarkable sign. I guess the point that I'm making is just this. Jesus did all of the kinds of magic tricks that a lot of people say that they would like to see. But I think that even if God would come down in the midst of us and do something like that for us, I think it's just as likely to get the same kind of result here and now as it got back then. Not that many people responded to all of the great works that Jesus was doing. Were they significant? Yes. Were they something that could have been considered a sign? I think, absolutely so. But what kind of impact did it actually have? Really not all that much. Jesus, in speaking to those who make such demands, made the statement that this is something that comes from people that are not right in their heart. I see today's generation as people that are like that. He says this is an evil and an adulterous generation that seeks a sign, and certainly I think that we could see that amongst the people in our day. There are some folks that are famous, maybe we could call them opinion leaders. They're book writers, guest on various kinds of shows. They're on the internet, they're all over the place. And they're making demands. I think of people like Hitchens, I think of people like Sam Harris, and I find Sam Harris particularly bothersome, but at the same point in time, they're not alone. There's a whole ilk, the Larry Krauses of the world, and they're all basically, piping the same kind of objection to Christ and to God, and that is that they want to see God come and put on a show for them. They say that the claims of Christ, the claims of God's existence are of such a nature as that there are extraordinary claims. And in their minds, of course, they like to quote Sagan in saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think, what a bunch of hooey. It doesn't matter what kind of quality of evidence a thing has. What really matters is whether or not it happened. Right? I mean, that's all that really matters in anything that we're dealing with that's a matter of fact. Did it really happen? I mean, there's a lot of things that happen that don't leave extraordinary evidence. There's even a lot of extraordinary things that don't necessarily leave extraordinary evidence. I can think back to a day when I was quite younger. Perhaps many of you remember all of that folderol that went on with the O.J. Simpson trials. Now, every now and again you run into somebody who has a different opinion than I do on this subject matter. But to tell you the honest to God truth, I watched that case very closely. I watched the goings on in court, particularly in the indictment and whatnot, very closely. And the evidence that was presented in that case was absolutely astonishing. I mean, it was one thing laid after another, laid after another, laid after another. It was so evident and obvious, and so, in my mind, so clear. And yet, a jury sat there for 45 minutes after 9 months of testimony, threw out all the evidence, and just came up with a verdict that, after the fact, many jurors said was a foregone conclusion in their mind. And I think that we have seen, not only in the stories that we are seeing here in the Bible and the response that Jesus got to people, but in our own day and age, I think that we see the same thing, is that people may clamor for evidence. People may say that they're waiting on evidence. People may say that they need to see better evidence. People may say that it hasn't been proven to them. And the long and short of it is, I think that there's ultimately, in all of those kinds of thoughts, something else that's working underneath it all, and that's just disbelief. Right? When somebody has just adopted, in the depth of their heart, an attitude of disbelief, it doesn't matter what they say about evidence. I think that the response that they're ultimately going to have, even in the face of evidence, is rejection. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion. They're not going to take 45 minutes to make a decision. They're going to just discount anything that they don't want to seriously consider. They're just going to discount it and move on, right? So, claims of extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, to me that's just a motto for disbelief. It is something that should be seen for what it is, a smokescreen. The issue, it seems to me, is whether or not somebody, even if there was sufficient evidence before them, if they would have a heart that's humble enough to accept it. And I think that that's where the real rub comes. Whether or not somebody has a heart that would be willing to yield, to humble itself, right? And I think that's what Jesus was getting to. He was saying that it's an evil and an adulterous generation that seeks a sign. Now, the Bible tells us that everything that can be known about God is easily rendered just by looking around. By the creation itself, the Scriptures tell us in the book of Romans chapter 1 that you can understand about everything that you need to understand about God. You can understand His invisible qualities. You can understand that this has been put into place by something, right? It's funny today, but I mean, it seems like even a child would understand that everything that begins to be had a start. And everything that has a start has a starter. I mean, that seems like that is something that even a child could understand. And yet today, we have ample evidence within even the scientific realm that things had a start. But what does the evil and adulterous generation do? Discount it, try to undermine it, try to make yes no and no yes, make day night and night day. Why is that? Well, because there is something else going on that has to do with the heart and not with the facts. There's something else going on that has to do with the soul and not what can be seen. Right? And that something is just an evil and an adulterous heart. Now, what did Jesus mean when He said evil? Well, he meant that it's malicious, painful, that it is something that is just ugly. Folks, I think in their natural condition, for the most part, certainly have the capacity for an evil heart. I think the Bible says that we're all born in sin, that we are all sinners by nature. And I think that it's only a small step to understand where that ends up taking people given any amount of time. Where does it take people? Well, I think it takes folks in the broadest sense toward an evil heart. An evil, malicious, just a heart that is set at antagonism toward God. Now, an adulterous heart is a heart that is just looking for something else. And I think this really gets to the heart of what makes the kind of folk that we're talking about here at this time particularly evil, is that they're looking for anything but God. You know, I think that even folks that sometimes end up being religious, they'll go through a succession of things that they're looking into, or that they're trying out, or that they're trying to understand, that they're trying to find answers in. They'll go through a succession in them. But usually what you find is that Christianity was never part of the succession. Now, that's not always true, but I think it's often true. And in that particular cases, in those cases, I think it's quite evident that those folks are exhibiting an adulterous heart. What does an adulterous heart say? Anyone but Jesus. Anyone but God. Give me the government. Give me evolution. Give me something happening, this whole existence coming from nothing, without any God starting it. Anything but God, anything but Jesus. I think that is a very clear, a very salient part of the heart of an adulterous generation. And folks that have that kind of attitude, I think that's really part of what drives that. Anyone but. I mean, they just don't want to deal with the reality of God. Now, why would someone feel that way? Well, I think in Jesus' day it was quite clear that the powers that be, the Pharisees and the scribes that are talked about in our text, they wanted a Messiah, supposedly. They just didn't want it to be Jesus. They would have accepted somebody who looked mighty and powerful, right? They would have accepted somebody who was wealthy and powerful. They would have accepted, I think, somebody who was a usurper of political power. They would have accepted anyone, but not this guy. This guy runs around with fishermen. And all the fishermen out there said, I can see why. He runs around with fishermen. He hangs out with the nondescripts out on the public square. Not this guy, anyone but this guy. For goodness sake, he comes from Nazareth. Oh. Talk about prejudice, right? So, we see that adulterous attitude so clearly presented in the way that folks responded to Jesus in his day, particularly those of influence and power. Anyone but. And I think that is just the heart and soul of so much of rejection of Christianity. It's not about the facts. It's not about a case proven or disproven. It's not about reality or make-believe. It's about one thing. They have an adulterous heart that just doesn't want God to be part of their life, period, the end. I mean, if God reached out and smacked them in the face, they still would reject. Why? Well, because it's not a matter of fact. It's a matter of adultery. And their hearts are adulterous. Evil and adulterous, and they don't want to accept Christ. Now, what is Christ's response to such a thing? He says to these kinds of people, they should expect no other effort by God than what he is going to do in line with the sign of Jonah. Now, the sign of Jonah was that Jonah was swallowed by a great fish. This is what we find in the book of Jonah. Some people get all bent out of shape about the technicalities of that. I want to tell you that it was perfectly proper in ancient Hebrew to call a whale a great fish. Right? There's no technical issue in trying to make something to do about that. Whether it was a whale, we don't even know. I mean, that's more tradition than anything else. I mean, it could have been, there's other great fishes, right? There's groupers, there's sharks, there's other great fishes in the sea. It could have been any of those, right? To get all caught up in those kinds of things like some people get caught up in, most of the time when you actually look at the things that are bothering them, you find that, again, they have the marks of an adulterous heart rather than they do somebody who's actually pursuing the truth concerning God. So anyhow, Jonah gets swallowed, and he's there in that fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he gets spit up on the land, and then, is free to ultimately go and fulfill his prophetic mission. And Jesus said that the only sign that's going to be given to the adulterous in heart, those that are part of the evil generation, that are just unwilling, anyone but God, just unwilling to yield. He says the only thing that they're going to have to go on is the resurrection of Christ. He says, as the Son of Man, just like Jonah was 3 days and nights in the belly of the whale, and don't get caught up that's an idiomatic expression, 3 days and nights. Basically what that means in English is 3 days. Right? Sometimes you have to do a little bit of work when you're looking at the Bible in idiomatic expressions. Idiomatic expressions are not those expressions made by idiots. Idiomatic expressions are those expressions that mean something beyond what's on the face of it. So, for instance, a common one that we all use in this country is the word White House, or the words White House. What do we mean by that phrase when we say the White House is lousy? Do we mean that if you go out on the street and you find a house that's not blue or red or purple or some other, it's white, that it's going to be a lousy house? No. Why? Well, because there is a meaning to that phrase that's above and beyond the individual words in it. Right? This is an idiomatic expression. The phrase itself has a meaning that's distinct from the words that make it up. And so when we use a phrase like the White House in reference to our seat of government, we're using an idiomatic expression, such as the nature of 3 days and 3 nights. It's an idiomatic expression in Hebrew. It's not meant to convey precise details like it had to be 72 hours or something like that. It did not have to be that way. It's just a way of saying 3 days in that particular language at that particular time. So don't get all caught up in that. But what Jesus says is that the only sign that's going to be given to the folks that want anyone but Jesus, anyone but God, the only thing that they're going to have to make up their minds about is the sign of Jonah, which is that Jesus would go into the grave, and on the third day he would not be in the grave anymore. Right? There was the death and burial of Jesus Christ, and then there was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that singularly is the only sign that's given to an evil and an adulterous generation. Now, when you think about that, what that means is that the only thing that we really have to put out there in the broad public, the only thing that we really have to argue about with those who want to make an argument about Christianity is the resurrection. I mean, we have all kinds of apologetic approaches to people who are part of the adulterous generation, and they get nowhere. I mean, you can argue yourself till you're blue in the face with somebody who's part of the adulterous generation. Anyone try it? Right? It doesn't matter what you do. Every argument that you make, even if they don't have a rebuttal, every argument that you make will eventually get back to, well, that's not enough for me. It's not extraordinary enough for me. It's not probative enough for me. It just doesn't have the power of evidence with me. And you'll throw this at them and this at them, and it doesn't even matter that you can line up 8 gazillion things in a row. You know, that you have an open and shut circumstantial case. Doesn't matter, right? Because their heart is evil and adulterous. They don't want God, anyone but God. They want themselves in charge ultimately, but if they can't live with that reality, it's anyone but God as he actually is. An evil and adulterous generation. The only thing that you have against them, or the only thing that you have that might be a lifeline to them, is the resurrection of Christ. What's the one thing that Jesus says is the sign that is given to the adulterous generation? And I think that we are very much seeing that is something we're very much still a part of. He says it's the resurrection. Now, I'm going to just say a couple things about the resurrection here that I think are important from a factual standpoint, and that I think are something that is very strong just from an evidential basis. First off, I want to say to you that the resurrection of Christ is the whole basis of the gospel. When you look into the Bible to get the testimony as near as we have it from any source of what was the actual source, what was the actual content of the message of the first Jesus movement, the people first following after Jesus, first establishing the church, first establishing Christianity. What was the central core of their message? Jesus rose from the dead, we saw it. The central core of Christian doctrine from the earliest days was not, this is a better way to live, this is a kinder way to live, this is a gentler way to live, this is a more wholesome way to live, this is a way to live that God, if you live this way, God will look on you with favor. That was not the message of the first followers of Christ. As we have it in the Scriptures, the message of the first followers of Christ was this: Jesus rose from the dead, we saw it. Amen. That was it. You know, that doesn't seem like that would be much of a sermon, would it? I mean, can you imagine if I said that, and that's all I said? All of you would say, hey, we're getting at it early today. And you would, find glee in that and go on, right? But that is the message of the early church. Christianity is not about a way of life. I mean, a way of life does ensue, but that's not the message that Christianity should lead with, and it's not the message they led with in their first permutations. It was all about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That was the thing that drove them and that motivated them. We need to keep that in mind. I mean, that tries to. There are folks, part of the evil and the adulterous generation, as it's seen in our day and age, that will try to blunt that, try to change that, try to undermine that, try to get you to point at something else that was driving that first community. But it's not true. The thing that drove the establishment of Christianity was only one thing and one thing only. We saw Jesus risen from the dead. That was it. So we have that. Secondarily, we know this, is that the Jews, kind of after the fact, realized that the resurrection of Christ was a danger to their efforts to get rid of him, and that it was the one thing that could undermine their status. And so the Jewish leadership, the Jewish authorities at the time, actually conspired and made what I would say would be an illegal effort, at least by their own faith. If they actually believed what they said they believed, right, they would have to see that encouraging, suborning perjury, if you will, was not the way to try to shut this thing down. But that's what they decided to do. And they tried to undermine the testimony of the resurrection of Christ. They paid off Romans. They persecuted people that made the claim. Sometimes they got beat. Sometimes, particularly in Stephen's case, right, he ended up getting killed. But the Jews were absolutely dead set, and when I say Jews, I mean the Jews in power at that time, absolutely dead set on squelching the story of the resurrection of Christ. And they were exerting what power and what influence they had to accomplish that. And guess what? They couldn't do it. I mean, if you were a good Jew, you would at least respect the Sanhedrin. And there was good Jews saying they saw Jesus raised from the dead, who would rather abide by that testimony than abide by the Sanhedrin. What does that tell you? It tells you that there was something going on in those first witnesses of the resurrection that was driving them and moving them, that was even driving them and moving them against their own self-interest. I mean, if you were a good Jew in Israel at that time, I mean, it was to your self-interest to go along with the people that were trying to cover it up and trying to dismiss it and trying to get rid of it, and who were willing to do things like pass out money to get it done. It was against your self-interest to do it. I mean, all the Jews, if they wanted to squelch it, all the Jews had to do, especially with their considerable resources to do it, all they had to do was produce a body. You would think that they would go looking. I know that they did. But they never produced a body. They never produced a body, though if anyone ever had the power to do so, it would have been them. I mean, all of those people that were making the claim that they saw Jesus risen from the dead, I mean, we're talking about, the Bible says 500 people at one time said that they were there and making the claim. But you would think that even, if you take that small of a crowd, let's say 500 people, there's got to be a weak link. Boy, that's harder to say than I thought it would be. There has to be a weak link someplace in there, right? There's got to be someone who's a little substandard. Not all of them are going to be golden boys or golden girls. There's a weak link in there someplace. All you have to do is find it, right? Exert a little pressure, grease a few palms, make things a little pleasant, or things a little unpleasant, especially for family and people that they cared about. And all of those things were certainly in the purview of the Jews who wanted to squelch the story of Jesus' resurrection. But guess what? They came up with squat. They couldn't find anyone who could lead them to the body, who would lead them to the body. They couldn't find the body. Why? It wasn't there. He who rose from the dead ascended into heaven. They couldn't find the body because the body was in use. In use in the heavenlies. And I got to tell you, if Jesus could walk right through the crowds that were trying to kill him as he was ministering, there was nothing to prevent him doing that after the resurrection. No, they couldn't come up with a body. It would have been the simplest, easiest thing to do, and it was so within their power to do it, and yet they could not, they did not. They were absolutely dedicated to it. I mean, even when you think about the writings of the Jews since that time about Christ, it's something that they could have done. Something that they were trying to do and something that they did not do. Did a bunch of silly, poor fishermen. Did a bunch of hicks. You know, we had that guy from Tennessee who made it big just, saying that the guys from Washington didn't understand the average everyday person. Did these average everyday bumpkins manage to outwit and outmaneuver the cream of the crop in Jerusalem? Well, I think that says something. So we have, number one, that this is the clear testimony of the early church. Number two, the Jews did not produce the body when they had the power to do so. And then we come to the third thing that I want you to pay attention to, and that is just this. The Romans got involved, and as the Romans got involved, they got involved as they started seeing the spread of Christianity present in their minds a threat to the whole Roman system. Now, the whole Roman system, believe it or not, was based on, at least at this premise, or at this time, it was based on this premise that the emperor was divine. Right? There was a they called it the genius of Caesar. It didn't mean that he was smart. It meant that he had a divine spark. There was a divine quality to him. It wasn't even the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings says that God raises up the servants into these places of power and authority, and that everyone, if they want to get along with God, should abide by them. That's the divine right of kings. That's a different thing. The Romans went a step further. It's not that the king had a divine right. It was that the king himself was divine. And so when it came to Christianity, they kept on running into a problem, is that Christians were unwilling to acknowledge the divine spark in Caesar. They wouldn't light incense to him. They wouldn't otherwise respond appropriately to Caesar or to Roman gods, and they saw this as an undermining threat to just the system of the empire itself. And so, in their pragmatic way, they responded, with pragmatic means. If somebody's not doing what you want them to do, what's a pragmatic way of dealing with that? Well, you can bonk them on the head, you can poke them in the side, you can torture them, you can put them within an eyelash of death, you can threaten them and their family with slavery. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do when you have power and no limits to it. And that's what was at the disposal of the Romans. Now, what they did was they put people not only into persecution, but they put people under the threat and under the experience of torture and pressure like you would not believe. And guess what they got for all of that? Squat. They got squat. What did they need? At least in the early Romans, they needed one person to buckle. One person to buckle under the threat, under the use of force and power. One person to buckle and say, wait a minute, I take it back. I know this is what I said, but I was wrong. That's not the case. Bring out the incense. I'll honor Caesar. That's all they needed. They needed one person who claimed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. They needed one of those people to buckle. Did they exert the effort to accomplish that? Yes, they did. And they did so in cahoots with the Jews, believe it or not. How many people did they get to do that? Zero. There is not a record anywhere in history of one of those witnesses of the resurrection ever recanting. Not one of them ever changed their mind. Not one of them ever buckled under the pressure. Not one of them ever got guilty at on their deathbed. We often have, that's the stuff of stories, right? Someone did some awful thing, lived their whole life with it in secret, then on their deathbed, they're feeling guilty before they go into eternity and they have to tell somebody, right? No cases of that. There is nothing. History is absolutely silent in this regard. There is nobody that ever changed their mind about seeing Jesus risen from the dead. No one ever changed their testimony about that. No one ever said, no, we thought it was a good story to tell, so we got together and we decided that we would try to pull this one on people and see what would happen. No one admitted that they were in error personally, and no one ever admitted that they were in cahoots with other people to try to pull a fast one over everyone. Nothing. It's not that that was not attempted to be accomplished. It was. But no one ever did. Now, what does that tell you? Well, here we have this very clear testimony that the early church, that this is what gave birth to the church, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have the Jews who expended all of their efforts and power to squelch that. And it should have been the easiest thing in the world to undo it. All you had to do is produce the body. Right? All you had to do is produce the body. I would say all you would have to do even really to tell you the truth, at least at some point in time there, was produce a body. Couldn't do it. All that the Romans, in their power, in cahoots with the Jews, had to do was get one person. There was 500. 500 in the broad sense, and if you want to cut down to just the disciples and those followers, maybe 20. Just one of them. To debunk the resurrection of Christ, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to be done in the day that it had occurred. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to undermine it. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to once and for all prove to everybody through all history that there was nothing there. But it was not done when it could be done. It was not done when it would have been easy to do. It was not done when the powers that needed to be in place to get it done were in place to get it done. It was not done when it could have been nipped in the bud, so to speak. It was not done when it mattered. What does that tell you? It tells you that the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a story that the people who told it believed was absolutely true, and that the people that wish it wasn't couldn't stop. Jesus said there's only one sign that's going to be given. And I think that he said that in some respect to get across this notion. There's only one sign that needs to be given. It's only one sign that any of us need to come to terms with. And it settles our fate eternally, whether for heaven or for hell. And that is, do we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ or not? To not believe in it, what would you need? Well, let me turn the tables on the so-called smart atheists that we have writing books that seem like they come from idiots. Let me turn the tables on them and say this. Given the historical facts that we have concerning the beginning of Christianity in Christ, I want to see the extraordinary evidence that proves that Jesus did not rise from the dead. To me, it's an extraordinary claim to say Jesus did not rise from the dead. On what basis do you say that? Well, no one rises from the dead. Well, duh. Isn't that the point? Right? The only reason it seems to me that you can just make a blanket statement about Jesus not rising from the dead is that you are part of an adulterous generation who just doesn't want to believe. Anyone but Jesus. But I think that the historical evidence is solid beyond belief. So where's your extraordinary claim? Where's your extraordinary basis to debunk the resurrection of Christ? Show us the body. It's kind of hard to do after all these years. Show us the recanter. The person who later on denied the testimony. Show us, and I think this is to me the best evidence, show me why people that actually believe in the resurrection of Christ experience incredible changes in their life. People who were awful turn into people who are wonderful. People that have no love at all in them, in their experience nor in their heart, end up being some of the nicest, kindest, most gentlest people you ever want to see. Why is it that people that actually believe in the resurrection of Christ end up coming to a peace that passes understanding, and end up coming to experience of God that actually includes signs that Jesus said were not really in play for this? So if you show me somebody who believes that Jesus actually rose from the dead, very many of those people have experienced things like healings, have experienced guidance from God that's come in a moment that's kept them from doing something incredibly stupid, that's enabled them to help somebody in a situation for which they had no knowledge or understanding about how to be helpful in that situation. On and on and on we could go, could we not? The long and short of it is that the people who claim that there is no evidence for the resurrection are the very people who don't have any evidence that the resurrection didn't happen. The very people who make the loudest claims against the resurrection of Christ are the very people who don't have a leg to stand on evidentiarily. Evidentiarially. There's got to be an adverb in there, I think. The people who make the loudest claims against Christ Jesus are the people who are the least willing to deal with the evidence that's actually there, that are adulterous, that are, despite the fact that it's standing before them in glory and magnificence, will say, I can't see it. Where is it? To me, the extraordinary claim is that Jesus did not rise from the dead. That's the claim that doesn't make sense with facts. That's the claim that doesn't make sense with history. That's the claim that doesn't make sense with experience. That's the claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Where is that extraordinary evidence? Well, it doesn't exist. Why? Because Jesus rose from the dead. This is the only thing. So let me ask you today, how do you feel about the resurrection of Christ? I mean, do you think it's a good story, but not quite so sure about it? Do you hope that it's true more than you know it's true? I mean, if you're on the fence at all, if you're kind of in la-la land concerning the resurrection of Christ, I just want to say today, this is the one thing that God has given that you need to get all in over. This is the one thing that you need to jump on board fully, both feet, everything that you've got. This is the one thing that you need to stand in and stand on without shaking, not even a little. Do you have a reason to? I think the evidence is overwhelming that yes, you do. You do have a reason to deny it. To deny it, you have to find extraordinary evidence for extraordinary occurrences, and that evidence just doesn't exist. So where are you with the resurrection of Christ? Are you all in? Are you fully bought in? Fully invested? Fully surrendered? That's where you need to be.